Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to my first MTG Arena theory video. Today I want to talk about something that I have recently become aware of when I made my first top decks deck tag for Mono Red. In the thread on Reddit, people made me aware that there is a sort of mulligan rigging going on in MTG Arena that I wasn't aware of actually, where the client basically picks draws two opening hands and gives you the one with the closest um, land to spell ratio to the average of your deck. So that means if you get like in your 24 land deck, get a 3 land opener and say a 2 or 4 land opener, the game will give you the 3 land opener to increase consistency of opening hands, reduce mulligan percentage, and make the games have be less non-games without too much other interference, and to compensate for the lack of a best of 3 in the best of 1 format. This, however, is a change that only applies to best of 1 ladder to compensate for the lack of best of 3 and a sideboard. In any best of 3 format, there will no be such rigging. This is exclusively to best of 1 ladder, as they have stated. Anyway, I wanted to talk a bit about this rigging and its effect on the game, because I feel like the effects of it are misunderstood and overrated, especially in terms of deck building, because in the post there was a lot of debate going on about basically that you should only run 22 lands in a deck like Mono Red on MTG Arena instead of the usual 24, because of how this affects opening hand probabilities and stuff, but I firmly disagree with this statement, and I'll dive into how and why that's the case. Alright, let's take a look. So this is the forum post that someone in the Reddit discussion linked to me, and it basically dives into the probabilities of this double mulligan and the prioritization of opening hand land counts. Here we see the blue line is the steady progression of paper magic, and the zigzag line is the MTG Arena opening hand progression with the assumed prioritization of certain land to spell ratios based on the land to spell ratio in a given deck. So the thing that can be seen is basically that from 21 to 22 lands, there's a huge jump, and then again from 25 to 26, there's a fairly big jump, and there's like a bunch of info. I'll link this to anyone that doesn't know it or just knows that it exists, but not how all the numbers work out and stuff. There's also chart for both progressions. Basically, the main thing we can see is this is a very steady progression that if you focus on the 3 land section, it just steadily goes up by about 1.8% for each land that you add to a deck, and then keeps growing. And you can also see that even in paper, there's a shift from prioritizing 2 land hands to 3 land hands, but it happens more significantly around the 23rd land in Magic, and not at the 22nd like in MTG Arena due to the change, and also the change is much less drastic. But it's still a clear flip. Like here we have a 31% to have a 2 land hand, and here we have a 30% to have a 3 land hand, while the 2 land hand percentage, or here the 3 land hand percentage, is significantly lower. But like I already said, it's a much more smooth and steady progression, so the gap is pretty small. While here in MTG Arena, we see a clear focus on 2 land hands, but the percentage is much higher. It's more than 50%, and at 22 it flips around, and we suddenly see the 50% plus for the 3 land hands and the 30% for the 2 land hands. But the main the main thing that I think this does basically is it flattens the variance of your opening hand quality in terms of land and spell ratio by cutting out the lower percentage extremes of like 1 and 0 landers, and also like the 4+ or even 5+ landers, depending on how much land you run. Because if you look at this, here we have a much smoother progression outside of the core probability of 2 and 3 landers for the early hands, or like the 24, 25 land decks, where it slowly falls off towards 0 and towards 7. While here in MTG Arena, we see it heavily clusters. More than 80% of your opening hands will be 2 or 3 land hands, and the rest is just like very minor chances, and 6 and 7 land hands are almost non-existent, and even 5 land hands are extremely low percentage until we start getting into like 26+ lands, which is the control land range. And the same goes for 0 land hands. They are almost non-existent as well. So the opening hand range is more between like 1 to 4 lands, or even 2 to 4 lands, with 1 playing like a minor role to keep you sort of honest and just keeping things real, and that you sometimes just have to mulligan. It's part of the game. But yeah, what I feel like is heavily overstated in this thread and also in the Reddit discussion is that you don't build your mana base just for your opening hand. You build your mana base for your mulligans, and also for all the consecutive turns, and for the curve that your deck requires, and to have X land by turn X reliably, and so on. And it is important to state that this mulligan rigging only applies to your first 7. So every time you, even though you have to mulligan less, every time you have to mulligan, you don't have any helper anymore, any rigging. Then you're just drawing a natural 6 from a deck, just like in paper. So anything that you cut as a result of this like reduced mulligan percentage will in turn hurt you every time you actually have to mulligan, even though you have to mulligan less often. So that is something that is worth to keep in mind, which is why I think overreacting by something like cutting 2 lands from a 24 land deck like mono red, which may or may not be like a 23.5 land deck in paper roughly, and just airing on the 24 because it has good flood protection with Hazoret and the deserts, and especially we have Ramunap ruins here still, so it's even better at flood protection. So I can absolutely not recommend going below 23 lands in that deck. Like, I can see maybe being like, okay, the deck is between 23 and 24 normally, and with this flattening of variance, we can go to 23, but going to 22 is not recommended. I played the deck a fair share on MTG Arena, and the one thing that I noticed, I played with 24 the entire time until up to the video, and recently tried a bit with 23 by adding in a braid in place of a mountain. And first of all, I'm not sure if it still feels good. It actually could be feeling a bit worse than before, because the deck actually doesn't mind hitting its land drops. Like, you have 4 Hazoret. If you happen to draw more lands than you need, a lot of the time you can just ditch them to Hazoret. You also have your Earthshaker Kenra Eternalize on 6, and you have your Ramunap Ruins on 5 with 8 deserts in the deck. So the deck makes really good use of spare lands, but it operates very poorly when it's stuck on 2 or 3 lands a lot of the time, because being able to hit your drop your Hazoret on time and emptying your hand enough to actually immediately hit with your Hazoret are very important, and also being able to do multiple things in the early turns by hitting your land drops, it's also very critical to the deck's success. So skimping on land, not something you want to do. And like I said, like if we look at the chart here, while the curve overall is a lot more zigzaggy, you can see that the core opening land count that you want in a given land range is much more flat. Like we have a very steep progression here of lands in your opener. Well, here we have an almost flat progression on the 3 lands. So this will stabilize your opening hands mostly around 3 landers, which is actually what you want, because if we look here, the average land count in case of mono red, 24 in paper, is 2.8 lands. And that is something that we should focus more on in deck building, I think, than on the probabilities for the opening hand, because the opening hand is only one part of the deck. Sure, like someone argued in the Reddit thread, the opening hand is particularly critical to a deck like mono red and all. It is very critical, and it's more critical to a deck like mono red than to some other decks, but it doesn't change the fact that the deck really wants to hit its first 4 lands almost every time if it can, without flooding out too much, and the deck has good flood protection, like I said. And if we look here, the average land count is even slightly lower with the MTG Arena mulligan on 24, and just stabilized around the 2 and 3 land hands, which is exactly what you want with mono red. You want your 2 to 3 land opener, and then draw some lands off the top over the next couple turns to hit your 3rd and 4th and maybe 5th land, without getting too many like 5 to 7 and 0 to 1 land hands, because those are the ones that you have to mulligan and that hurt you. But you also have to keep in mind, land count isn't the only reason to take a mulligan. Especially with a deck like mono red, there are plenty of other reasons to mulligan. If you don't have a 1 or a 2 drop, you're gonna mulligan. If you don't have enough creatures, you're gonna mulligan. And every time you're gonna mulligan, you actually have to mulligan with a proper paper mulligan. You're not gonna get the double mulligan on 6, like I said. So it seems extremely greedy as a conclusion to just be like, alright, our deck just got more consistent, so why keep it consistent if we can just cut 2 more lands to add some 2 random cards by making our deck about as consistent or less consistent than it is in paper. Like, this is an improvement over paper, basically. It drastically reduces the need to mulligan, because it reduces one of the major reasons for mulligans, which is land spell distribution in opening hands, but it's not the only one. Like I said, especially in aggressive decks, you often want to aggressively mulligan for proactive hands and good curves to get out of the gate fast, because that's much more important than having a 7th card in your opening hand a lot of the time. And this is mainly what this does, this change. It makes your deck more consistent. It doesn't really provide you much basis for suddenly skimping on land more, because all that's going to do is basically taking away from the consistency this adds, because every time you mulligan, you're going to be screwed over more, and a lot more times you will have these 2 or 3 land opening hands that get stuck on 2 or 3, for example, and you will just not get there, and then you just wasted the consistency this gives. Sure, you have a 50% chance to get a 3 land opener, and if you have a 3 land opener, you have a pretty good chance to hit that 4th land and all, but you're still reducing the chance of not doing so. And if you don't and have that Hazoret in hand, that might be the difference between winning and losing. Or if you are able to go like Magma Spray, Uncrop Crasher on 4 and stuff like that. And the entire time that I played with the 24 lands, with this mulligan being unaware of it, I didn't feel like my deck had too much land. Like, the mulligan didn't make me this mulligan rigging didn't make me feel like I suddenly run too much land in my 24 land mono red compared to paper. All it did is that now in hindsight that I think about it, I mulliganed surprisingly little compared to what I would expect from this type of deck in paper, because unless basically the kind of cards that I had in my hand, I mostly didn't need to mulligan because of opening hand land issues, and that's great because having to mulligan less increases your win percentage a lot. So why make it worse again by cutting lands? It's just not worth it. And there is a nice post that tackles this a bit more on page 6 by Mimwect, and he dives into that a bit further, and basically shows that the only two lands that have like drastic impacts are land 22 and 26, where the numbers deviated drastically from paper, and in most other cases the mulligan rigging of MTG Arena basically reduces the impact of a land that you add to your deck by 30% in terms of affecting your opening hand. But it's still gonna improve your opening hand the same way as adding 0.7 lands would be in paper. So it still has an effect on your opening hand. Like, you shift the probability of getting a 4-land hand rather than a 2-land hand if you don't get a 3-land hand, for example, which is something that's particularly relevant for mid-range decks, which is why there's still a lot of point in running 25 lands in mid-range, not running 26, because then you suddenly get 4-land hands more than 3-land hands, which is not really something you want in mid-range, because I think for most mid-range decks the sweet spot is still 3 lands, like 3 to 4 lands rather than 2 to 3, with an emphasis on 3, which is exactly what you get around 25. Like around 25 you are more likely to get 4 if you don't get 3, and like around 22 you're more likely to get 2 instead of 4 if you don't get a 3-land opening hand. That's basically what you want with these types of decks. And you can see here, like in the chart also, how the progression is kind of similar to paper, but it's artificially increased by a lot. Like, you see the overall progression and range of opening hands and lands is much lower. It's like all the probabilities are below the 40% mark, while here the key opening hand land counts are artificially raised past the 50% mark. And they also see how they intersect, like how around 25 you get close to the breaking point where you kind of have like an opening hand range between 2 and 4, still with a focus on 3, but you have about an even chance of getting 2 or 4 lands, and I think it basically barely ekes out the 2-land chance. And yeah, here you can see some more charts how these things progress, and the conclusion that he draws is that outside of the 22nd and the 29th land, adding a land to your deck still has almost the same effect as in paper, just slightly less strong. So there is still a lot of point in adding that 23rd, 24th, or 25th land to your deck, and there's also no need to add that 26th land to your mid-range deck that otherwise would run 25. And especially in this format with all the deserts, there's so much good flood protection that you're actively making your deck worse by cutting lands. Like, look at these black-white vampire decks, for example. They have like 4 Shepherd Dunes and 3 of the black deserts, and they have 25 lands, and they want their 25 lands. And suddenly, if you cut lands from that, like, what are you even getting? Your mana base is great utility, and all you push is your chance in the end to mulligan a bit more, because cutting land still increases your chance of having to mulligan due to the wrong land count in your opening hand, just not as much as in paper, but still does. And on the other hand, making your mulligans worse if you have to mulligan due to other reasons. And then if you mulligan to 6 and get a worse 6 because of having cut land from your deck compared to paper, it also increases your chance of having to go to 5 and to 4 and so on. Like, all these percentages add up and just cost you consistency. There's also some charts that show you like the progression and how it's basically like centered around the middle here and artificially, yeah, shaped differently. And yeah, you can just read the text. He explains all these things a bit more in depth, and I think it's a pretty good analysis. And if I read it correctly, it basically underlines and supports my intuition and assumption about how these things changed. And yeah, basically, in the end, the conclusion that I would draw is don't go overboard on changing your mana base just because of this mulligan. Be happy that your deck is more consistent and has to mulligan a lot less than in paper, but the land count of your deck is determined by a lot more than the amount of land you want in your opening hand. And even in regards to that, like I showed here, if we could look at a stat that we are working towards while building a mana base for a deck, I would say it's more like the average land count that your deck needs in their opening hand. If you look at like a stat for opening hand orientation, and if your deck and paper wants around a 2.8 land average in your opening hand, there's no reason to go below a 2.7 land opening hand stat and drastically crippling your mulligan draws, and also reducing the chance to have close to 3 lands on average in your opening hand, and suddenly getting a lot more 2-land hands where you just sit there, don't hit your 3rd or your 4th land on time, and just stuck and lose because of that. Just not worth it. Stick around the 2.7 to 2.8 land average. Be happy that your variance is drastically flattened by this manipulation, and you suddenly mostly get playable, great functional hands as long as the spells you get are the right ones. And be content with it. Like, I don't get why people are always so greedy and be like, oh, our decks got more consistent all of a sudden, so how about we make them more inconsistent to add this 1 or 2 non-land cards to them? Like, it's just not, it just doesn't make any sense. You're just hurting your percentage, and I can already like see the people in the comments being like, yeah, but I played my mono red with like 22 lands and even added like, I don't know, 2 glory bringers instead of those 2 lands. I think I've read that somewhere, which is like, what the? Like, you add 2 5-drops to a deck that you just cut 2 lands from just because the mulligan rigging flattens your opening hand variance, but not actually change the average amount of lands you have in your opening hand. It just flattens the variance. You just have less spikes, less extreme outliers like 0 to 1 lands and 5 to 7, but your average land count in your opening hand will still be roughly the same as in paper, just less fluctuation. So there's no way of justifying stuff like that. It just doesn't make any sense. And like, if you look here, the average percentages are not very big. They're even slightly reduced here in MTG Arena between 22 and 25, because we have a bit of a jump from 22 in paper to 22 in Arena. There's like an artificial increase, but 23 and 24 lands, you're still kind of like a bit behind Like in 23, you're still a bit ahead of paper, and on 24 lands, you start already being a bit behind in paper on your average opening hand. So yeah, it's very reasonable that 24 land is still even at a correct number in MTG Arena, and at best, I think it is 23. I don't think there's a way that 22 is as good as 24 in paper. Like, running 22 here in MTG Arena is at least as bad as running 23 in mono red in paper, and no one in their right mind does that. All the reasonable and good players play 24 in their Ramunap red, so don't be stupid, don't be bad, don't be greedy, don't cripple your decks. And yeah, check out the posts, I'll link them in the description, and I hope this reaches some people and makes them reconsider this, because sure, there are these jump points where things significantly change compared to paper, but I feel like a lot of people look at it and just see it as a justification to make their decks worse and jump to the wrong conclusions, rather than trying to understand what this change actually means for deck building and how much it means for deck building. And unless I'm completely off here, I feel like this is drastically misunderstood and overrated currently, and just a lot of people using it as a justification to squeeze some additional cards into their deck that they always wanted to squeeze in. And in paper, they see all these good players, all these pros playing like these land counts, and they're like, well, I guess I have to do it, and it's right. And now they see this analysis and be like, yay, finally a justification that I can like point towards and be like, but this says this is all ideal and this is better, when it isn't even, and it's just kind of like a misinterpretation, like wrong analysis of the data in my impression and my understanding of things. All right, I hope this helps you guys. I think it's given that I think that it doesn't really force you to build weird 22 and 26 land decks, but basically just makes you err on the lower side if your deck is like an X.5 deck, like for example mono red arguably being a 23.5 land deck on paper and not an actual 24 land deck. But since you can't run 23.5 lands, you run 24, because 23 is worse than 24 in a deck with flood protection. So you rather run half a land too many than a half a land too few in terms of win percentage and consistency. But yeah, this just basically allows you to run the 23 in these kinds of decks, for example. But all in all, I think it should not really affect deck building particularly much. Like the 27 land control deck that usually plays the 27 to maximize the chance of having their like 3+ land openers and not being screwed and stuck on land early on, now can maybe safely be like, okay, 26 is good enough if I have enough early card draw and stuff like that. But that's about it. And if this assumption is correct, that it doesn't particularly warp deck building, but rather just lets you remove the overly cautious safety net of rather running half a land too many than too few, I think this is actually a pretty good change. Generally, I'm not a big fan of rigging at all. I think I would have been fine to just not have it, but I can see why they did it, given that the variance in a single game in Magic due to the mulligan system can be particularly high. But in terms of rigging and stuff they implemented, I think this seems like a pretty good implementation, because it, from my understanding, doesn't warp deck building particularly much, unlike what a lot of people believe, and just gives you more consistent opening hands, more playable opening hands forces you to mulligan a lot less due to simple general variants, and only leaves you mostly with the mulligans that are deck related, like mulliganing for keycards and for curve and stuff like that, which is something that you chose in deck building and not the just random outlier land spell distribution you choose that you can only control so much in deck building. Alright, that's it for this discussion. I hope it wasn't too rambly and you guys could follow my trail of thought. And let me know in the comments what you think, and if someone thinks or knows that I'm somehow off track on my assumptions, intuition, and interpretation of this data, let me know in the comments, but only if you can provide some proper evidence to actually prove me wrong, because otherwise I'll just stick to my interpretation and the support for that interpretation and intuition that I have found, plus my 15 plus years of Magic experience at all levels. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe down below. Make sure to check out my other MTG Arena videos and my social media and stream over here to catch me live and catch all the latest updates. And that's it for my very first MTG Arena theory video discussing the rigged mulligan system in MTG Arena Best of 1 Constructed. And I'm ManuS, thanks for watching, see you next time, bye.